Hey everyone, this is Brown. I have Brown. Hope y'all are doing okay tonight. I must apologize for my lengthy absence. The reason I was gone for so long was because I was actually more than a little sick not that long ago. I had a really bad upper respiratory infection. Oddly enough, it was not COVID, but regardless, I was out for 2 weeks, and even when those 2 weeks came and went, my voice was so scratchy that I sounded like Harvey Firestein. And there was no way that I was going to try and do a review when my voice sounded that scratchy and when it hurt that much just to talk. But recently, my voice got to where it started to sound normal again, both to myself and others. And also, I started to feel confident enough to where I felt like I could go ahead and get back into the review game here. So here I am, here y'all are, here we are together. And so let's get into it. And tonight we are going to be talking about Shadows in the Mist by Brian Moreland. So this was put out in 2006, which was 2 years after I graduated from high school. And lo and behold, it is an autographed copy. Sadly, not autographed to myself, but nonetheless, the fact that it's autographed by the author, it's really cool. So, I actually found this copy over at a half-price bookstore years ago, and there's a really neat story as to how I was made aware of this book. And it was actually by Brian Moreland himself. We've never actually met in person, but he had actually read a review of mine that I'd done over on a website called ePinions, which that site sadly no longer exists. But I had done a lot of reviews on there, books, comics, movies, and my handle was Real Ponderings. But one of the reviews I had done was for a Michael Mann horror movie called The Keep, which was in turn based on an F. Paul Wilson horror novel, a World War II horror novel to be exact. And Brian Moreland was one of the people who had read my review, and he liked it, and he actually reached out and gave me a nice compliment on it and recommended that if I liked World War II horror novels that were similar to The Keep, that I might want to give his debut novel a shot. And so I definitely put it on my list of things to do at some point in the future, but it wasn't until recently that I got around to finally reading it. And so I just find it funny how all that just kind of came together. And this was actually a really, really well, done horror novel. Or I should say a World War II horror novel. And also considering the fact that this was Brian Moreland's, first novel altogether. I'm not sure if he had done short stories before this, but this was his first full-length novel, if I remember correctly. It was. It was his first full-length novel, but not necessarily his first written work, if that makes sense. But I really enjoyed it, and I thought that it did a good job of combining the real-world horror of World War II, and as well as the supernatural horror of, the things that haunt the book, so to speak. So anyway, though, the story, starts off in this World War II vet, a guy by the name of Jack Chambers, has a nightmare about his time in World War II in Germany, and this leads to him having a heart attack and having to be rushed to the hospital. And shortly after that, he calls his grandson, Sean, to come and see him. And so Sean, who also served in the military, he and his granddad have, that much in common, amongst other things. Like, they both served in the military, and So, naturally, they both have a distinct camaraderie with one another. And so Jack is wanting his grandson Sean, to run a sort of errand for him, albeit one that's going to take him all the way to Germany. Namely, he wants him to take this journal to a former comrade in arms, an American general who's stationed in Germany, because he's wanting not only the military to know, but the world in general to know what really happened to his platoon in October of 1944. And so his grandson, he's always wondered about that, because he knows that something happened with his granddad in World War II, specifically in October of 1944, that he was the only survivor of his platoon, but he never talked about it. And other than the official story of the platoon coming to grief, he didn't really know what happened. And so Sean decides, okay, yeah, I'll do it. I mean, I don't know what's going on, but I'll take this to Germany for you. And so when he does this, he's actually pursued by interested parties, not personnel who are not in the military, let's just say. And they warn him back. They say, if you take this to the military, if you give this to the person that your grandfather is wanting you to give it to, it will lead to rediscoveries of ancient secrets that are best left buried. And these interested parties, keep following Sean throughout Germany. And Sean is more and more on edge. I mean, he doesn't know who these people are other than the information that they give him. One of them was a rabbi who supposedly served with his father during this event, that is sort of being kept in the dark. And so he's more determined than ever to get this journal to the military general that his grandfather was wanting him to get it to. And so by the time he does, the general in question is able to examine it, and he's able to decode it, as it were, because it was written in such a way to where you had to decipher it, and to keep I guess prying eyes from picking up information that could lead to disastrous consequences. But once this general in question has deciphered the book, he actually asks Sean to meet him one evening, and tells him that there's a decision that needs to be made here about whether or not this information gets out to our military and in turn the world. But I need you to understand what's at stake here. And so he gives him a translation of the entire diary that his grandfather had written. And once he reads it, he finds out the truth about what happened to his grandfather and his platoon on October of 1944. And that's when you go from sort of almost like an espionage thriller, which is what the book seemingly starts off as, albeit with a rather disturbing nightmare to start things off. But once Sean starts reading the book, that's when Jack Chambers, the young man, the World War II veteran, comes into play as the story's main character. And that's when we are thrown into a full-on horror novel set in World War II. But I really enjoyed this novel. It was, I could definitely see why Brian Moreland actually, recommended this to me, because there's definitely more than a little bit of inspiration that was taken from The Keep, but at the same time, this is a novel that stands on its own with, say, a writer's unique ideas, and everyone borrows from someone, regardless of the art, whether it's writing, plays, novels and things, what have you. But the trick is, to take inspiration from what's come before and make it your own. And I honestly feel like that's what Brian Moreland did with Shadows in the Mist. And I think the book, it was already intriguing with its espionage sort of feel. What with Sean going from America to Germany with possibly hostile parties going after him, and it felt like kind of a spy thriller almost. But once he gets to Germany, and once he starts reading the diary, the translated diary, that's when the book changes gears, and we are thrown into a world that is, on one hand, it's familiar if you've read the history of World War II, or at least read something of the history of World War II, in that there's the horror that was straight up warfare, man fighting against man, fighting behind enemy lines, not knowing when you're going to get your next resupply, not knowing when or if you're going to get reinforcements. But then the supernatural comes into play, namely the I don't want to spoil exactly what the supernatural threat is, but I will say, though, that there are times where you have elements of, say, zombie horror with a little bit of vampire vibe almost, but then you take those vibes and then you throw in Jewish mysticism mixed with Nordic mysticism, and you end up with a supernatural threat that is wholly unique and dangerous. And the protagonists of the book, or I should say, the protagonist is Jack Chambers, but his comrades are called the Lucky Seven, because they've gotten through all sorts of crazy experiences during the war, and they have their own rituals of brotherhood of hey, there's secret handshakes, hey, we're gonna survive this mission, and so on and so forth. And so they've pulled through together through many situations that were supposed to be suicidal, I guess you could say, but they've come through every time. But this is the mission that ended the lucky streak, so to speak. And the trick here was to make these characters, I guess you could say, relatable, despite the fact that that they're all going to die, with the exception of Jack Chambers. But because of the amount of time that Brian Moreland takes in fleshing the characters out and developing the camaraderie with all of them, I mean, you really come to care about these guys. And even as they go up against threats that are both mortal and immortal, so to speak, I mean, you're on the edge of your seat. And I think that takes talent right there. Like, to make a reader care about a character even when their ending is already written on the wall, so to speak. And so in this case, you knew that certain characters were going to die. I mean, there was no ifs, ands, or buts. But the trick was finding out how they died, and also making it to where the readers cared about them. And I think Brian Moreland did a really good job with that. And I also appreciate how, okay, so sometimes you'll have a work of horror in which there are many manifestations of, say, supernatural manifestations of evil, but then you find out that it's all coming from one person or one entity or one thing, as it were. Take, for example, Stephen King's It. I've never actually read the book, but I have seen the miniseries from the 90s, and I saw the first part of the remake that came out not that long ago. And I understand that what a lot of people are saying about how it's one monster manifesting itself as different things, which on one hand, I mean, it definitely resulted in some fantastic images of horror, but at the same time, it was a bit of a letdown once you found out that it's all just one monster, one creature at the end of the day. And so that was a problem that I don't think Shadows in the Mist had, because it was kind of the opposite in a lot of ways. The main characters, sorry, tongue tied. The platoon, the Lucky Seven, they only see certain forms of evil, or they only come across certain forms of evil, both when it comes to, I guess you could say, the human evil and the supernatural evil. But at the same time, though, as you learn more about what these monsters are and what exactly the Lucky Seven are going up against, you find out that there's quite a bit at work. I mean, as I said, there's Jewish mysticism and Nordic mysticism being thrown into the mix, plus whatever experiments that the Nazis were already working on at this point. And so even though you only see maybe one or two types of threats, it's made very clear that certain supernatural forces do exist within this setting, even if it's just either behind the scenes or they're dormant, but they do exist. And if people go looking for these forces and extract secrets from them, or just snippets of power that can be used, then new forms of evil can be created. And so that's something that I really appreciated, like, say, as opposed to the way a story like It would handle something like that. And so I just appreciated that it was kind of like an opposite of the story It. Like you saw multiple forms of evil, but they're only coming from one creature with It. But with Shadows in the Mist, you only see maybe one or two forms of evil, but it's made very clear once the secrets are learned by the characters of what's going on. It's made very clear that there are so many more forces at work here, and they just scratched the surface. And in that respect, I felt like there was an element of Lovecraftian horror which was thrown in. And not to say that the book was a Lovecraft work of horror, it's just that there's that element of mankind confronting just the barest trace of the unknown and barely surviving it. And so, or if they do survive it, they're severely traumatized by it. And that was something that I really appreciated. And of course, this being a World War II horror novel, the Nazis have a big part in all this. Both, I guess you could say, in straight up combat, before the supernatural comes into play, as well as, say, when certain characters who are introduced at certain points in the book are revealed to not be who they claim to be. aka spies and saboteurs. And it goes hand in hand with the supernatural elements of the book. And one thing I will say is that the idea of Nazis trying to find, say, a supernatural power to win the war, that's actually something that was based on fact in some ways, because a lot of the Nazi high command had sent expeditions to certain part of the world to try and find, I guess you could say, artifacts or some trace of the supernatural that they could use and bring back and win the war against the Allies. Now, there's a lot of literature that's written about, those I guess you could say, I'm not sure like how many books have been written about the expeditions specifically, but just about the idea of Nazis trying to find a supernatural way to win the war. There's all sorts of literature written about all that, as well as there have been a few documentaries that have been made about the same subject matter, which personally I'd like to get into, because it's a fascinating subject. Who knows how close we were to losing the war, or how close they were to getting something supernatural, and where they could have beaten us. So I thought that was a nice touch, how there was an element of fact in this world of horror fiction. Aside from the fact that this is set in World War II, and it takes place in Germany for the most part, just the fact that it was based on a mission that the Nazi High Command had tried to accomplish. And so thankfully they didn't, as far as we know. But I also liked how there are certain parts in the book in which certain characters they have interactions with one another that they get a lot more fleshed out to the readers, and a lot of them, I guess you could say, are more some of them are more memorable than others. I'm sure you as a reader will have your own favorites, but there's a moment, I will say, that it was towards the climax of the book, in which Jack Chambers, the main character, he and his squad are about to engage in a siege. They're the ones being besieged by this seemingly endless horde. But he has the time, while he's waiting for the siege to begin, he decides to write a letter to a woman that he fell in love with back when he was on shore leave. And he's always been putting it off, because he's thinking, oh, that was a one-time thing, I'm never going to see her again. But he's thinking, well, no time like the present. And he just puts his heart into it, and he tells her everything that's on his mind, and just how much their time together meant for him. And it's very relatable. I'm sure those of you listening, I'm sure you've been in love with someone and you've wanted to reach out and communicate with them, connect with them, and so you just put all your cards on the table, regardless of the likelihood being slim of them reciprocating. And except in this case, he's in a situation which he is almost certainly not going to be coming back from. And then he remembers that he has a letter from that same woman that she had given to him right before he had gone back into the war. But he had always put off reading it because he was afraid it was going to be a Dear John letter. And I will simply say that once he decides to, get over his fear of reading it, he finishes writing the letter to her, and then he decides, okay, go ahead and read her letter, get it over with. it's not a Dear John letter. And I'll just, I'm not gonna say, whether or not I actually got a tear in my eye, but I will say that I was just floored at how emotional this whole scene was. I mean, especially, with the back and forth between the two, even though it was only through letters, but it's just that it was one of those moments where it turns out, yes, there was a two-way connection there. And, this man, he's given incentive to try and, I mean, he already has incentive to try and survive this siege, but he has even more of one now because he realizes that, this woman that, he came to, fall in love with, I mean, she feels the same way about him. And he's like, okay, I'm doing my damnedest to come back from this one. I'm going to get as much of my squad back alive as I can, and I'm going to make it home to her. And I'm going to start a life with her. I'm going to start a family. And he's saying this in confidence because he knows that she feels the same way because she just told him in her letter. And the power of that moment, I mean, I was sitting down when I read it, but I was glad I was sitting down because I would have had to sit down. Like if I were standing up, I'd be like, okay, this is too much. I need a moment, and it was just very emotional. And it was, I really appreciate when a writer can do that. But, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and give Shadows in the Mist 5 out of 5 stars. I mean, this was an excellent, World War II horror novel, and if you're into that particular type of horror, Shadows in the Mist is definitely a good addition to that, and you would not be wasting your time if you were to seek this book out, to check it out. And it was actually a pretty swift read too. I mean, whether that was just because of the pacing or just because I was that swept up into it. Yeah, I mean, it alternates between, sort of almost espionage thriller and then, straight up, the horror of war itself. And then, oh God, we've got hell on earth that we're going up against. So, and then of course you have, the emotional scenes to make you more attached to the characters, which, work quite well. And so all in all, I mean, this was an excellent read, and I'm looking forward to at some point in the future checking out more of Brian Moreland's stuff. But thank you very much for taking the time to check out my review. Y'all got any questions, comments? Please let me know. And like what you see here, feel free to hit the like button and subscribe. And so y'all have a good night. Stay safe. Take care. Goodbye.